Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into one of medieval history's most impossible stories. Forget everything Hollywood taught you about knights in shining armor and noble quests. We're talking about a world so brutal, so unfair, so completely rigged against certain people that what I'm about to tell you should never have happened. But it did. Picture medieval Europe, a place where your birth determined everything. Born a king, you die a king. Born a peasant, you die a peasant. Born a slave? Well, you're property forever. End of story. Except sometimes it wasn't the end. Tonight, we're exploring the incredible, blood-soaked, almost unbelievable journey of slaves who did the impossible. People who started their lives as human property and ended up as knights. Real knights. With swords, horses, titles, and the legal right to command other men. This isn't a fairy tale. This isn't some feel-good fantasy about hard work paying off. This is the story of how war, desperation, and raw human courage occasionally cracked open the most rigid social system in history. So grab something to drink, get comfortable, and let me take you back to a world where the impossible sometimes happened. Where chains could become crowns, where slaves could become legends, and where the most unlikely people imaginable rewrote the rules of an entire civilization. This is the story of the slave who could become a knight. And trust me, it's wilder than anything you've ever imagined. Number 1, a world where slaves weren't meant to rise. Picture this, you wake up in medieval Europe, but you're not a lord in a castle or even a peasant with your own dirt floor. You're something worse. You're property. Human property. You belong to someone else like a horse, a plow, or a wooden bucket. Your name isn't really yours. Your body isn't yours. Your future, definitely not yours. This is life as a medieval slave, and let me be clear about something from the start. The movies lied to you. That noble knight in shining armor? He probably owned 3 or 4 people just like you. That romantic castle on the hill? Built with slave labor. Those grand feasts and tournaments? Paid for by the sweat and blood of human beings who were bought, sold, and worked to death. You were born a slave because your mother was a slave. Or maybe you were captured in a raid when you were 7 years old, watching your village burn while strange men in metal helmets dragged you away in chains. Picture that moment. One day you're helping your father tend sheep, playing with wooden toys, sleeping in your own bed. The next, your property. A thing less valuable than the horse they rode in on. Or perhaps your parents sold you to pay off a debt. Yes, that happened. Parents selling their own children like livestock because the alternative was watching the whole family starve. Imagine your father's face as he hands you over to a stranger, tears in his eyes, knowing he'll probably never see you again. Imagine your mother turning away because she can't bear to watch. This was normal. This was Tuesday in medieval Europe. The medieval world had a simple rule about people like you. Know your place and stay there. You wake up before dawn, not because you want to, but because someone kicks you awake. Your day starts in darkness and cold, usually in pain from yesterday's beatings or overwork. You work until your hands bleed, you eat scraps, and you sleep in whatever corner your master gives you. If you're lucky, it's a barn with the animals. If you're not, it's the ground outside with the pigs, sharing your sleeping space with rats and your own tears. Your clothes are rags that smell like sweat, animal waste, and despair. They're handed down from other slaves, patched with whatever scraps can be found, and they stay on your body for months at a time. There's no washing them regularly. Water is for drinking and cooking, not for cleaning slave clothes. The fabric is rough, scratchy, and often crawling with lice. In winter, these rags provide almost no warmth. In summer, they trap heat and stench against your skin. Your food is whatever's left after everyone else eats. The master and his family eat first, then the servants, then the animals, and finally you. If there's anything left, often there isn't. You survive on bread crusts, vegetable peelings, sometimes a thin broth made from bones that have already been boiled 3 times. Meat is a fantasy. Fresh fruit is a miracle. Salt is so precious that adding it to your food would be considered theft. Your bed is straw mixed with your own tears, sometimes shared with other slaves, always infested with insects. The straw gets changed when it starts to rot, which isn't often. You sleep curled up for warmth, trying to ignore the bites from fleas and bedbugs, the scratching of mice, and the moaning of other slaves who are sick, injured, or just broken by the hopelessness of it all. And your future? More the same until you die. Probably before you turn 30 from exhaustion, disease, or just plain hopelessness. There was no retirement plan for slaves. No pension, no comfortable old age. You worked until you couldn't work anymore. And then you died. Your master might bury you in an unmarked hole, or he might just leave your body for the animals to dispose of. But here's the thing about the medieval world that Hollywood never tells you. It was brutal, unfair, and completely insane. The same system that crushed millions of people like you sometimes, just sometimes cracked open. Not because it was kind. Not because it was just. But because it was desperate. You see, medieval Europe was constantly at war. England fighting France, France fighting Germany, Germany fighting Italy, everyone fighting the Muslims, the pagans, each other. War was the default state of existence. Peace was just a brief pause between conflicts, a chance to sharpen swords and count the dead before the next round of killing began. And when desperate times came, when war was knocking on every door and death was walking through every village, the impossible could happen. A slave could pick up a sword. A slave could charge into battle. A slave could do the unthinkable. A slave could become a knight. But don't get excited yet, because the path from chains to chivalry was paved with blood, betrayal, and more suffering than you can imagine. Most slaves who tried to rise ended up dead in a ditch somewhere, forgotten by history. Their bodies rotted in unnamed battlefields. Their dreams died with them. Their names were never recorded because names were for people who mattered. The few who made it. Their stories are so wild, so unlikely, so completely insane that they sound like fairy tales. Stories of men who started the day cleaning horse stalls and ended up being knighted by kings. Stories of warriors who couldn't read their own names, but could read a battlefield better than educated generals. Stories of people who rose so far above their origins that their former masters bowed to them. Except they're not fairy tales. They're real. And they're about to show you just how twisted, brutal, and occasionally miraculous the medieval world could be. The system was designed to be unbreakable. Church doctrine taught that God himself had arranged society in perfect order. The king ruled because God wanted him to rule. The nobles were noble because God made them that way. The peasants farmed because that was their divine calling. And slaves? Slaves were slaves because God had marked them for servitude, either through sin, bad luck, or simple divine will. To challenge this order wasn't just rebellion against human authority. It was rebellion against God himself. The church taught that trying to rise above your station was the sin of pride, the same sin that cast Satan from heaven. Better to accept your suffering in this life and hope for reward in the next. This wasn't just religious theory. It was backed up by a very real, very violent enforcement. Slaves who tried to escape were hunted down with dogs, tortured as examples, sometimes killed in creative ways to discourage others from getting ideas. The law was clear. Slaves had no rights, no legal standing, no hope of appeal. They existed at the complete mercy of their owners. And yet, within this seemingly perfect system of oppression, there were cracks. Small ones, hidden ones, but cracks nonetheless. Because even the most rigid system needs flexibility to survive. Even the most oppressive society sometimes needs to break its own rules. War was the biggest crack of all. When your kingdom was facing extinction, when enemy armies were burning your cities and killing your people, suddenly the purity of bloodlines mattered less than the number of swords you could put in the field. Suddenly, the religious arguments about divine social order seemed less important than practical questions about survival. And in those moments of desperation, when the choice was between maintaining social purity and winning battles, pragmatism usually won. Not because the nobles became enlightened or kind, but because they wanted to keep their heads attached to their necks. That's when they looked at you, filthy, uneducated, legally no better than livestock, and saw something they desperately needed. A potential soldier. A weapon they could aim at their enemies. They didn't see you as a person deserving of opportunity. They saw you as a resource to be exploited. But sometimes, when you're fighting for your life and your freedom, it doesn't matter why someone hands you a sword. It only matters that they did. Number 2, war. The great equalizer. War doesn't care about your social status. War doesn't care if you're noble or common, free or enslaved, educated or illiterate. War just wants bodies. Lots of bodies. And in medieval times, when kingdoms were constantly trying to murder each other, there were never enough volunteers to fill the ranks. Medieval warfare was a hungry beast that devoured men like a fire devours dry wood. Armies would march out with thousands of soldiers and limp home with hundreds. Disease killed more men than enemy swords. Infected wounds turned minor injuries into death sentences. Battle injuries that would be easily treatable today, a broken leg, a deep cut, a dislocated shoulder, often meant slow, agonizing death in a medieval army camp. So guess what happened when your lord got a message from his king saying, "Bring me 200 men to fight the French"? He looked around his lands and started counting. Free peasants who owed military service, check. His own sons and nephews, check. His household knights and professional soldiers, check. But still not enough. Never enough. That's when his eyes turned to you and every other slave on his property. Congratulations, you just got drafted. Not because anyone thought you deserved a chance at glory. Not because they believed in your potential. But because they needed warm bodies to throw at the enemy's spears, and warm bodies were in short supply. Your master would walk through the slave quarters like he was shopping for cattle. You. Grab whatever weapon you can find. You're going to war. No ceremony. No patriotic speeches. No promises of glory or honor. Just a rusty weapon shoved into your hands and a rough push toward the road. The logic was simple and cold. If you survived the battle, great. Your master kept a living piece of property and maybe gained a more valuable, battle-tested slave. If you died, well, that was one less mouth to feed, and he could always buy another slave with his share of the war profits. Either way, he filled his quota and kept the king happy. You were expendable, disposable, forgettable. Your life had no value except as a tool to protect the lives that actually mattered, the nobles, the knights, the free men who owned property and paid taxes. But here's where it gets interesting. War, for all its horror, was also the one place in medieval society where your birth didn't matter as much as your blade. On the battlefield, a slave with courage could outshine a coward with a title. A serf with strength could save a lord's life. A nobody could become somebody, even if it was just for a few bloody minutes. The thing about combat is that it strips away all the social pretenses, all the elaborate hierarchies, all the careful distinctions between noble and common. When someone is trying to put a sword through your chest, they don't care if your great-grandfather was a king or a pig farmer. They care about whether you can stop their blade and put yours through theirs first. And sometimes, and not often, but sometimes, the slaves were better at this than their masters. The nobles knew this, and it scared them. They wanted soldiers who would fight hard but still know their place. They wanted bravery, but not ambition. They wanted you to kill their enemies, but never dream of something better for yourself. They wanted you to be a perfect weapon, deadly when pointed at foes, harmless when the fighting stopped. So they sent you to war with one foot still in chains. You could carry a sword, but you couldn't keep it when the fighting stopped. You could wear their colors, but you couldn't sit at their table. You could die for their cause, but you couldn't live for your own. The equipment they gave you reflected this attitude. While knights rode into battle covered in steel-plate armor, carrying swords forged by master craftsmen, riding horses bred for war, you got whatever was left over. A rusty sword that had been discarded by someone else. A wooden shield that might stop one good blow before splitting. Leather armor that would turn aside a glancing blow, but offer no protection against a direct hit. Your training consisted of maybe a few hours with an old soldier who showed you which end of the sword to hold and reminded you to try to stick the enemy with a pointy end. No lessons in strategy, no practice with mounted combat, no instruction in the complex codes of chivalry that governed knightly warfare. You marched to war on foot while the nobles rode horses. You slept on the ground while they had tents. You ate whatever scraps the army could spare while they dined on the best supplies. Even in the army, the hierarchy remained rigid and brutal. Most of the time, that's exactly what happened. You fought, you bled, maybe you killed a few enemy soldiers, and then you went back to your life of servitude. The war ended, the weapons were collected, and you returned to cleaning stables and hauling water. Your brief moment as a soldier became just another memory of suffering. But sometimes, just sometimes, something went wrong with their plan. Sometimes a slave fought so hard, so brilliantly, so impossibly well that everyone noticed. Sometimes the rusty sword in desperate hands cut down enemies that expensive weapons couldn't touch. Sometimes the expendable property proved more valuable than the nobles who owned them. And once people noticed, things got complicated. Because it's hard to keep calling someone your property when they just saved your life. It's difficult to treat someone as livestock when they just proved they can kill better than your best knights. The system was designed to use you and discard you. But occasionally, very occasionally, you refuse to be discarded. And that's when the medieval world's carefully constructed social order began to crack. Because if a slave could fight like a hero, what did that say about the heroes who only got their positions through birth? Number 3, the desperate gamble. Picture the most terrifying moment of your life. You're standing in a field somewhere in France or Germany or England, and across from you is an army that wants to turn you into mincemeat. Behind you is your own army, including the lord who owns you like a cow. And in your hands is a weapon you barely know how to use. The battlefield stretches out like a vision of hell. Thousands of men screaming, banners flapping in the wind, horses snorting and pawing the ground, the sound of metal on metal as weapons are sharpened and armor is adjusted. The smell is overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, horse dung, leather, metal, and underneath it all, the sour stench of fierce sweat from men who know they might die in the next hour. Your stomach is twisted in knots. You might vomit from terror, which would be embarrassing but normal. Half the men around you are doing the same thing. Your hands shake as you grip your weapon, a rusty sword that's been used by half a dozen other soldiers before you, or maybe just a long knife or even just a sharpened farming tool. This is where most slave soldiers died. Right here, in the first few minutes of battle, when the two sides crashed together like waves of metal and screaming. The front lines were a meat grinder, and guess who got fed into it first? That's right, you. The strategy was brutal, but effective. Put the slaves and peasants in front. Let them absorb the first charge, the first arrows, the first spears. If enough of them died, maybe they'd slow down the enemy long enough for the real soldiers, the knights and professional warriors, to do their job. You weren't given armor because armor was expensive, and expensive things weren't wasted on property. A full suit of plate armor could cost more than a small farm. A good sword was worth a year's wages for a skilled craftsman. These were investments, and you don't invest in something you expect to lose. Instead, you got whatever was left over after everyone else was equipped. A rusty blade that had been discarded because it was too dull or damaged for a real warrior to use. A broken shield that had been patched together with scraps and hope. Maybe a leather cap if you were incredibly lucky, but more likely just your own hair and skull to protect your brain. Your job was simple. Run forward when they told you to. Swing your weapon at anything wearing the enemy's colors and try to take at least one opponent with you when you died. Nobody expected you to survive. Nobody planned for you to come back. You were human ammunition, loaded into the cannon of medieval warfare and fired at the enemy's wall. The nobles and knights positioned themselves behind you, ready to exploit whatever chaos you created. They had the good armor, the trained horses, the sharp swords, the tactical knowledge. Their job was to win the battle after you had died breaking the enemy's front line. This wasn't cowardice on their part, it was tactics. Medieval warfare often came down to who could maintain their formation longest, who could keep fighting when things got desperate. The knights and nobles were the backbone of the army, too valuable to waste in the initial clash. Better to let the expendable troops soften up the enemy first. But here's the thing about desperate situations. They create desperate people. And desperate people sometimes do impossible things. When you're facing death anyway, when you know your lord considers you disposable, when you have absolutely nothing left to lose, something changes inside you. Fear doesn't disappear. Fear never disappears. But it transforms. It becomes fuel. It becomes rage. It becomes the kind of wild, reckless courage that makes legends. Some slaves, standing there in the mud with death marching toward them, made a choice that changed everything. Instead of just trying to survive long enough to slow down the enemy, they decided to fight like madmen. Instead of hoping to die quickly, they chose to die gloriously. Instead of accepting their fate as expendable tools, they grabbed fate by the throat and tried to strangle it. They charged harder than the knights behind them. They fought longer than anyone expected. They killed more enemies than seemed possible for someone with minimal training and inferior equipment. And sometimes, when the smoke cleared and the screaming stopped, they were still standing. Standing over the bodies of enemy nobles. Standing next to fallen knights. Standing in the middle of a battlefield where they'd just done the impossible. Not just survived, but triumphed. Picture that moment. You're covered in blood, most of it not your own. Your rusty sword is now red with enemy blood. Around you are the bodies of men who had better training, better equipment, better everything than you. And yet you're alive and they're not. The surviving enemies are retreating or surrendering. Your own side is cheering. And suddenly, everyone is looking at you differently. Not as property, not as expendable meat, but as something new, something dangerous, something they don't quite know how to categorize. And that's when everything changed. Because it's one thing to send a slave to die anonymously in a crowd of soldiers. It's another thing entirely when that slave comes back covered in enemy blood, carrying enemy weapons, and looking like something out of the old heroic songs. Suddenly, you weren't just property anymore. You were a problem. A dangerous, complicated, sword-wielding problem that didn't fit into any of the neat categories medieval society used to organize itself. What do you do with a slave who fights like a hero? How do you treat property that just saved your life? How do you maintain social order when the person at the bottom just proved they're more capable than the people at the top? These were questions medieval society wasn't designed to answer. And when a system can't answer the questions reality is asking, that's when cracks start to appear. Number 4, from chains to sword. The moment you survived that first real battle, everything about your life became complicated in ways you never imagined. You walked off that blood-soaked field carrying weapons you'd torn from dead enemies, wearing armor you'd stripped from corpses, and most importantly, wearing something new on your face, the look of someone who had stared death down and won. Your fellow slaves looked at you differently now. Before the battle, you had been just another piece of property, another mouth competing for scraps, another body sharing the overcrowded sleeping space. Now you were something else entirely. When you walked past them, they stepped aside. When you spoke, they listened. Some looked at you with awe, others with fear, but none of them looked at you with the casual indifference they'd shown before. The other soldiers, the free peasants and common fighters, nodded when they passed you. This was huge. Before, they had ignored you completely or treated you with a contempt free men reserved for slaves. Now they acknowledged you as someone who belonged in their world, someone who had earned a place through blood and courage. Even some of the knights, the real ones, born into nobility, raised from childhood to be warriors, gave you a second glance. Not necessarily with respect, not yet, but with a kind of wary recognition. Because in medieval times, there was only one currency that mattered more than gold or land, proven courage in battle. But your master. Your master had a problem that kept him awake at night. Before the battle, you were simple property. A thing he owned, like his horse or his plow or his cooking pot. Easy to understand, easy to control, easy to replace if necessary. He knew exactly how to treat you, with casual indifference when you obeyed, with violence when you didn't. The relationship was clear, straightforward, backed up by law, custom, and religion. Now you were something else entirely. You were a killer, a warrior, someone who had proven they could take a life and survive in the chaos of war. Someone who had looked death in the face and made death blink first. How do you keep a proven warrior as a slave? How do you order around someone who just slaughtered 3 enemy soldiers with a broken sword and a handful of rage? How do you put chains back on hands that have learned to kill? More practically, how do you sleep at night knowing that the person who hates you most in the world is now trained in the art of murder and sleeps 20 feet away? Some masters tried the old approach anyway. Good job in battle, now get back to shoveling horse manure and remember your place. They figured that one moment of glory didn't change the fundamental reality of ownership, that a slave was still a slave regardless of what happened on a battlefield. They quickly discovered that warriors don't take orders the same way property does. A slave who knows they can survive anything, who has felt the rush of victory, who has been cheered by soldiers and feared by enemies, is no longer really a slave. They're a ticking time bomb. Some of these masters found themselves with mysterious accidents. A fall down the stairs, food poisoning, a hunting mishap where they got shot by an arrow from an unknown source. Not all slave warriors turned to murder, but enough did to make the survivors very, very careful about how they treated their newly dangerous property. Others tried a different approach. They gave these slave warriors better weapons, better food, better treatment. Not out of kindness, but out of fear. Because a skilled killer who hates you is more dangerous than an enemy army. Better to keep them happy, fed, and pointed at your enemies instead of your back. These masters started treating their slave warriors less like property and more like very dangerous employees. They couldn't free them. That would set a precedent that other slaves might expect. But they couldn't treat them like normal slaves either, because normal slaves don't know 17 different ways to kill a man with farming tools. And a few masters, the clever ones, saw an opportunity. Here was a warrior who owed them everything. Someone who could fight like a demon but still, legally, belong to them. Someone who could win battles and bring glory to their name without threatening their position. These were the masters who started training their slave warriors properly. Real weapons instead of rusty scraps. Real armor instead of leather rags. Real fighting techniques instead of point the sharp end at the enemy and hope for the best. You learned to fight with sword and shield, to use a spear from horseback, to command other men in battle. You studied tactics, the art of reading a battlefield, knowing when to charge and when to retreat, understanding how different types of soldiers work together. You picked up reading and writing, not because anyone thought you deserved education, but because a smart weapon is more deadly than a dumb one. You needed to read battle plans, understand written orders, communicate with other commanders. You learn about honor and warfare, the complex codes that governed how nobles fought each other. Not because anyone expected you to be honorable, but because understanding these rules helped you exploit them. Knowing when an enemy would expect mercy made it easier to kill them when they didn't deserve it. And slowly, battle by battle, year by year, you became something that shouldn't exist in the medieval world. A slave who fought like a knight, commanded like a lord, and won victories like a hero. Your master started introducing you differently. Not, this is my slave, but this is my man-at-arms, or this is my captain. The words were carefully chosen to avoid the uncomfortable reality, but everyone knew what you were. You started having your own equipment, your own horse, your own space in the army camp. Not because you were free, you definitely weren't free, but because practical necessity demanded it. You couldn't command other soldiers from the slave quarters. You couldn't maintain weapons and armor while living like livestock. But you were still a slave. Still property. Still someone who could be sold, beaten, or killed at your master's whim. You had the skills of a knight and the legal status of a plow horse. This contradiction couldn't last forever. Everyone involved knew it, even if they didn't want to admit it. Either you would be crushed back down into servitude, probably violently, or you would rise into something new. The question was, which would happen first? And would you survive long enough to find out? Number 5. When nobles took notice. Here's the thing about medieval nobles, they lived in a world where reputation was everything. Their entire identity, their whole sense of self-worth, their very reason for existing was built on being the best warriors, the bravest leaders, the most noble fighters. They weren't just rich people who happened to own land. They were a warrior caste, professional soldiers whose blood and breeding supposedly made them naturally superior to everyone else. It was literally in their blood, they claimed. Generations of careful breeding, centuries of martial tradition, the blessing of God himself, all of this combined to make them the perfect fighting machines. They trained from childhood in the arts of war. They learned to ride before they could walk properly. They practiced with swords while other children played with wooden toys. So imagine the absolute horror, the crushing embarrassment, the world-shaking humiliation when you, a slave, a piece of property, someone who shouldn't even be holding a weapon, started out fighting their sons on the battlefield. Picture the scene. After a major battle, all the lords and knights are gathered in the command tent, sharing wine and bragging about their victories. These post-battle celebrations are sacred rituals, chances for the nobility to reinforce their sense of superiority and importance. Sir William the Bold talks about how he killed 2 enemy soldiers with his expertly crafted sword. Sir Robert of Wherever boasts about capturing an enemy banner through his superior tactical thinking. Sir Geoffrey, the something goes on and on about his brave charge that broke the enemy line through sheer noble courage. And then someone mentions you. Did you see that slave of Lord Edmund's? The one with the scarred face. He took down 5 enemy knights single-handedly. Saved the entire left flank when it was about to collapse. Never seen anything like it. Suddenly, the tent gets quiet. The wine stops flowing. The bragging stops. Because everyone knows what just happened, even if nobody wants to say it out loud. You, a piece of human property, just did what knights trained their whole lives to do. You outfought men who've been practicing swordplay since they could walk, men who've had the best training, the best equipment, the best breeding money could buy. You made them look ordinary. Worse than ordinary, you made them look incompetent. Some nobles tried to dismiss it at first. Lucky shot, they'd mutter into their wine cups. Probably exaggerated in the telling. Enemy must have been wounded already. Anybody can get lucky once. But when it happened again, and again, when your name started being whispered around campfires and mentioned in battle reports sent to kings, dismissal became harder. When other commanders started asking to borrow you for difficult missions, when enemy soldiers started fleeing when they saw you coming, when your reputation began spreading faster than your master's, the excuses stopped working. Others got angry. How dare a slave show them up? How dare property act like it was their equal? How dare some nobody from the slave quarters make them look like amateurs in front of their peers? Some demanded you be punished, put back in your place, reminded of what you really were. They wanted you publicly humiliated, maybe beaten, definitely returned to manual labor where you belonged. The natural order had to be restored, they argued. Society depended on everyone knowing their place. But here's the problem with that approach. You were too useful to waste on making a point about social hierarchy. War was expensive, dangerous, and unpredictable. Good soldiers were rare and valuable. Truly exceptional soldiers, the kind who could turn the tide of battle, who could be counted on to win impossible fights, were worth their weight in gold. And you, for all your lack of breeding and education, were turning out to be exactly that kind of soldier. A few nobles, the smart ones, the practical ones, the ones who cared more about winning wars than protecting their pride, saw something different when they looked at you. They saw opportunity. Because here's what they realized. If a slave could fight like that without proper training, without breeding, without any of the advantages that supposedly made nobility superior, what could they do with real support? What if that raw talent was refined, educated, properly equipped? These nobles started paying attention to you in a way they'd never paid attention to property before. They watched how you fought, how you moved, how you made decisions in the chaos of battle. They studied your tactics, your instincts, your natural understanding of warfare. And what they saw impressed them in ways they didn't want to admit. You weren't just brave. Any fool could be brave for a few minutes before getting killed. You were smart, tactical, naturally gifted at reading a battle and knowing where to be. You had that rare combination of courage and intelligence that made great military leaders. You understood things that couldn't be taught in training. How to read an enemy's face and know what they were planning. How to use terrain to your advantage. How to inspire men to follow you into impossible situations. How to turn chaos into victory through sheer force of will and tactical brilliance. And that's when the really dangerous ideas started forming in their heads. Ideas that would have been unthinkable a few years earlier. Ideas that went against everything medieval society believed about blood, birth, and the natural order of things. Ideas about what might happen if they took a slave, property, a thing they owned, and made them something more. Not because they believed slaves deserved better. Not because they had suddenly become enlightened about human equality. But because they had a practical problem that needed solving, and you appeared to be the solution. They needed warriors who could win battles. You could win battles. The fact that you were property was just a legal technicality that could be adjusted if necessary. And that's how the impossible started becoming possible. One practical decision at a time. Number 6, the rare ceremony. What I'm about to describe happened maybe a dozen times in all of medieval history. Maybe less. Maybe more than we know, because record keeping wasn't perfect and some stories got lost. But it was rare enough, unprecedented enough, so completely against the natural order of things that most people thought it was impossible. Until it happened. And when it did, it shook the foundations of everything medieval society believed about blood, birth, and who deserved to hold power. The ceremony usually took place after a major victory, when emotions were high and normal rules seemed less important. Your lord, flush with triumph and grateful for your service, would make an announcement that stunned everyone present. Picture the scene. You're in a castle's great hall, or maybe a large command tent, surrounded by nobles, knights, clergy, and other important people. The air smells of wine, roasted meat, and the lingering smoke from torches. Everyone is celebrating a recent victory, and you're standing there wondering why you've been called forward. Your lord stands up, raises his cup for silence, and begins to speak. This man, he says, gesturing toward you, has served with honor and courage beyond his station. He has proven himself worthy of recognition. The crowd murmurs. This is already unusual. Slaves don't get recognized in public ceremonies. Property doesn't receive praise in front of nobility. Then came the words that changed everything. I hereby grant him his freedom. The murmuring stops. Dead silence. Because what your lord just announced was extremely unusual. Freeing a valuable slave was something that happened, but rarely and usually only for very special circumstances. It was expensive. He was giving up property that had real monetary value. It set a precedent that other slaves might start expecting. And it raised uncomfortable questions about why this slave deserved freedom when others didn't. But freedom was just the beginning. The crowd was still processing this announcement when your lord continued. And furthermore, I offer him the honor of knighthood. If there had been crickets in medieval castles, you could have heard them chirping. The silence was so complete, so profound, that you could hear people's clothing rustling as they shifted uncomfortably. Because what your lord just proposed was insane. Knights were born, not made. Knighthood came from bloodlines that stretched back generations, from family names that carried weight and history and divine approval. You didn't just become a knight. You were born one, raised one, educated one from childhood. The very idea of making a slave into a knight violated everything medieval society believed about itself. It suggested that birth didn't determine worth, that breeding wasn't everything, that maybe, just maybe, the whole system was based on convenient lies rather than divine truth. But there you stood, a former slave, about to undergo the same ceremony that turned noble sons into knights. The ritual itself was surreal, like watching two different worlds collide in slow motion. You knelt before your former master, now your sponsor, while he placed a sword on your shoulder and spoke the ancient words that had been used for centuries to create knights. Be thou a good knight and true, he intoned, following the traditional formula that connected you to generations of noble warriors. You swore the same oaths as every other knight, to protect the innocent, serve God, fight honorably, defend the realm, uphold justice, and maintain the chivalric code. The same words that had been spoken over countless noble sons were now being spoken over someone who had been property just minutes before. The same promises, the same obligations, the same sacred bonds that tied knights to their society and their god. A priest blessed you because knighthood was a religious as well as social ceremony. God himself was being asked to witness and approve your elevation. The same God who supposedly ordained that slaves should be slaves was now blessing your rise to nobility. You were given a sword, your sword now, not borrowed or stolen, but legally and rightfully yours. The right to bear arms as a free man, to carry weapons not just in battle, but in daily life. This was huge because weapons were symbols of freedom and status. Only free men could legally own swords. You received a horse because knights were mounted warriors. Not just any horse, but a destrier or courser, a war horse trained for battle, worth more than most peasants would see in their entire lifetimes. This horse would be your partner in war, your means of mobility, your symbol of knightly status. Most importantly, you received a coat of arms, a personal symbol that marked you as nobility, as someone with the right to own land, command others, and sit among the elite. Your coat of arms will be painted on shields, carved into stone, embroidered on banners. It will be passed down to your children and their children, marking your bloodline as noble for generations to come. But here's the twisted part. Everyone in that ceremony knew it was theater. A performance. A necessary fiction to deal with an impossible situation. Because what else could they do with you? You were too valuable as a warrior to waste, too dangerous to keep as a slave, and too useful to simply free and dismiss. Making you a knight was the only way to fit you into their system without breaking the system entirely. Your lord couldn't just say, here's a really good slave who helps me win battles. That would make him look weak, like he depended on property for his military success. He needed you to have official status, legitimate authority, legal standing. But he also couldn't admit that a slave had proven naturally superior to his noble knights. That would undermine the entire ideological foundation of medieval society. Better to pretend that your elevation was a reward for exceptional service rather than recognition of inherent ability. So the ceremony proceeded with everyone pretending that this was normal, that knights were sometimes made from slaves, that the system was flexible enough to reward true merit regardless of birth. The other knights watched with barely concealed disgust. Some whispered among themselves, questioning whether this was right, whether the world was ending, whether God would punish them for participating in such blasphemy. The nobles tried to look approving while privately wondering what precedent this set, whether their own slaves might start getting ideas, whether this was the beginning of the end of the natural order. Even some of the common soldiers questioned whether this was appropriate. If slaves could become knights, what did that say about the knights who were born to the title? If birth didn't matter, then what made anyone special? But you. You knelt there and took the oath, knowing full well that you were participating in something that should be impossible. A slave becoming a knight. Property becoming nobility. A nobody becoming somebody with a sword and the legal right to use it. The ceremony ended with the accolade, the ceremonial blow to your shoulder that completed the transformation. One moment you were a slave, the next you were Sir, whatever name they gave you. Often it was something related to your origins or your service, Sir Faithful, Sir Victory, Sir Battle One. When you stood up, you were technically equal to men who had despised you as subhuman just hours before. You had a title, a position, a place in their world that they couldn't legally deny, even if they hated every second of it. Whether they would actually treat you as an equal. Whether they would accept you into their brotherhood of warriors. Whether this ceremony meant anything beyond legal technicalities. That was another story entirely. And it was a story written in blood, jealousy, and the slow grinding of social change against ancient prejudice. Number 7. The jealousy of real knights. Congratulations, you're now Sir, whatever name they gave you. You have a title, a sword, and the legal right to call yourself a knight. You've achieved something that should be impossible, rising from slavery to nobility in a single ceremony. So why does everyone look like they want to murder you? Because in the minds of every real knight, men born into nobility, raised in castles, educated from childhood in the arts of war and chivalry, you represent everything wrong with the world. You're a walking insult to their entire existence, living proof that their most cherished beliefs about themselves might be lies. These men spent their whole lives believing they were special. Not just wealthy, not just powerful, but genuinely, fundamentally, divinely superior to common people. Their fathers were knights. Their grandfathers were knights. Their bloodlines stretched back generations. They learned to read and write when most people couldn't. They studied mathematics and philosophy, practiced swordplay from age 5, and absorbed the complex codes of honor that supposedly separated them from animals and peasants. They believed, truly, deeply, religiously believed, that noble blood made them better warriors, better leaders, better human beings. It wasn't just social conditioning. It was cosmic truth, confirmed by church doctrine and reinforced by every story they'd ever heard about heroes and villains. And then you showed up. A former slave who learned to fight by necessity, who can barely read, who doesn't know the difference between a dinner fork and a pitchfork because you've never seen either one used properly. You don't know the ancient songs about noble ancestors, you can't recite genealogies going back to Charlemagne, you've never hunted with falcons or danced at court or done any of the things that mark someone as truly noble. And somehow, despite all your obvious inferiority, you're now sitting at their table. Worse, you're probably a better fighter than most of them. That made you dangerous in ways that went far beyond your sword skills. You were living proof that their entire worldview might be wrong, that birth didn't determine worth, that maybe peasants and slaves were just as capable as nobles if given the chance. They started testing you immediately. Not just to put you in your place, but to prove to themselves that you really were inferior, that your elevation was a mistake, that the natural order would reassert itself eventually. The challenges came in many forms. Formal duels where they could use their superior training and equipment to humiliate you in front of others. Combat exercises where they demonstrated techniques you'd never learned. Tactical discussions where they showed off their education and made you look ignorant. Some of it was subtle warfare designed to make you feel unwelcome without giving you grounds for legitimate complaint. They used fancy words you wouldn't know, referenced history you'd never learned, made jokes about things only educated nobles would understand. "Oh, sir, what was your name again?" they'd ask with fake politeness. "Tell us about your family's coat of arms. What's the story behind those symbols?" "Oh, you just got them last week. How interesting." They discuss their noble ancestors while looking at you meaningfully. "My great-grandfather fought at Hastings. My grandfather was at Acre during the Crusades. My father distinguished himself at Cressy. And you, sir? Slave name? What glorious battles did your ancestors fight?" The message was always the same. You don't belong here. Everyone knows you don't belong here. And we're never going to let you forget it. Other times, the hostility was direct and brutal. "So, Sir Property," they'd sneer when their lords weren't listening. "Tell us about your noble ancestors." "Oh, wait, they were probably digging ditches and emptying chamber pots. They questioned your loyalty constantly. How could someone who had been property really be trusted with the responsibilities of knighthood? Wouldn't you always resent the people who had owned you? Weren't you just waiting for a chance to betray your betters? They criticized your fighting style, your equipment, your mannerisms. Everything about you was wrong, too crude, too practical, not refined enough for a real knight. But the worst part wasn't their insults or their attempts to humiliate you. The worst part was their fear. Because deep down, they knew something terrifying. If a slave could become a knight through courage and skill alone, what did that say about knights who only got their titles through birth? You represented chaos, the collapse of natural order, proof that the system they depended on wasn't divine law, but convenient fiction. If anyone could rise through merit, then their inherited advantages weren't God-given rights, but historical accidents. Some try to get you killed in battle, volunteering you for the most dangerous missions or accidentally leaving you without backup when fights got serious. Not because they were cowards, but because they genuinely believed the world would be better off without you. Sir Slavename should lead the charge against that castle, they'd suggest helpfully. After all, he's so brave, so skilled. Surely, he can handle a few dozen enemy knights by himself. Others spread rumors about you, questioning your Christianity, your morality, your worthiness to hold a noble title. They whisper that you were planning rebellion, that you couldn't be trusted, that your elevation was corrupting the very concept of knighthood. A few of the clever ones tried a different approach. They attempted to use you like their personal weapon while making it clear you'd never truly be their equal. They wanted the benefits of your skills without the inconvenience of treating you as a peer. Good work, sir. Whatever your name is, they'd say after you won a difficult battle for them. Now go kill those people for us. That's what you're good for, right? Fighting and killing. But here's what they didn't expect. You'd learned how to survive in hostile environments long before you became a knight. You'd figured out their games, their politics, their petty jealousies and power struggles. You developed the same cunning that kept you alive as a slave, except now you had legal authority and a sharp sword to back it up. And slowly, grudgingly, some of them started to realize something uncomfortable. You weren't going anywhere. You were too useful in battle, too valuable to your lord, too skilled to dismiss. They were stuck with you whether they liked it or not, which meant they had two choices: accept you as a legitimate member of their brotherhood, or spend the rest of their lives being quietly driven insane by your continued existence. Most chose the second option. But a few, the practical ones, the ones who cared more about winning wars than nursing wounded pride, began to see you differently. Not as an equal, that would take generations, but as a valuable ally worth tolerating. And that, in medieval terms, was almost like acceptance. Number 8, the burden of freedom. You thought becoming a knight would solve your problems. You imagined that once you had a title, a sword, and legal recognition, life would finally be good. The suffering would end, the respect would come, and you'd find your rightful place in the world as a free man among equals. You were wrong about almost everything. Because here's the thing about medieval society. It had a long memory and an unforgiving heart. You might be Sir something or other now, with all the legal rights and privileges that came with knighthood, but everyone remembered what you used to be. And they made sure you never forgot it. The other nobles spoke to you when protocol demanded it, but you were never truly invited into their inner circles. At feasts, you sat at the high table because law and custom required it, but conversation stopped when you approached. Laughter died when you tried to join in. Stories were cut short when you leaned forward to listen. You existed in their world, but not of it, a permanent outsider looking in through windows that would never fully open for you. Marriage prospects? Forget it. No noble family would marry their daughters to a former slave, no matter what title you now carried. Your bloodline was tainted, your origins too low, your family history non-existent. The best you could hope for was marriage to a merchant's daughter or a lesser noble's widow, women who needed the protection of your sword more than they cared about the purity of your blood. Business partnerships were equally problematic. Other nobles might work with you when military necessity demanded it, but they'd never fully trust you with their money, their secrets, or their plans. You were too dangerous, too unpredictable, too likely to remember old grievances and act on them. The common people weren't much better, though their hostility came from a different place. Some respected your rise and saw you as proof that anyone could make something of themselves if they were brave enough and lucky enough. These people looked at you with something approaching admiration. But others resented you for abandoning your origins, for putting on airs and acting like you were better than them now. Look at him, they'd whisper when you rode past. Thinks he's too good for us now that he's got a fancy title and a horse. Forgets where he came from. You couldn't win. You were too noble for the commoners, too common for the nobles, trusted by neither and accepted by few. And then there were the practical problems nobody talks about in the heroic songs. You had a knight's responsibilities now, complex legal obligations, land to manage, people to protect, courts to attend, taxes to collect. Most knights grew up learning these things from their fathers, absorbing the knowledge gradually through years of observation and instruction. You had to figure it out as you went, making mistakes that everyone noticed and criticized. When you made legal errors, other nobles shook their heads knowingly. What did you expect from a former slave? When your lands produced less income than expected, creditors questioned your competence. When your tenants complained about your decisions, everyone assumed it was because you didn't really understand how to govern. Money was always a problem. Your lands, if you had any, were usually the worst parcels your lord could spare. Rocky soil, difficult tenants, properties that barely broke even. Other knights inherited wealth accumulated over generations, lands that had been in their families for centuries, established income streams that required little management. You started from nothing and had to build everything yourself, often while paying off debts incurred and obtaining your knighthood. Armor, weapons, horses, all of this was expensive, and you had no family wealth to draw upon. Your children, if you managed to have any, faced their own special hell. They were legitimate nobles by law, but they carried the stain of their father's origins like a hereditary disease. Other noble children were cruel in the way only children can be, with a casual viciousness that comes from absolute certainty about their own superiority. Your daddy used to clean toilets, they'd taunt. My father says your father isn't a real knight. Everyone knows you don't really belong here. Some of your children embraced their unique status, using it as motivation to prove themselves even more thoroughly than you had. They became the most devout Christians, the most skilled warriors, the most honorable knights, desperate to wash away the stain of their grandfather's chains. Others were crushed by the weight of expectations and whispers, never quite fitting in anywhere. They lived their entire lives in limbo, too noble to associate with commoners, too tainted to be fully accepted by other nobles. The worst part was the loneliness. You couldn't go back to your old life. Those bridges were burned the moment you knelt for your knighthood ceremony. The slaves and peasants you had once lived among now saw you as a traitor, someone who had abandoned them for personal advancement. But you could never fully enter your new world either. You existed in a strange middle space, belonging nowhere completely, accepted nowhere unconditionally. Late at night, alone in whatever castle or manor house you called home, you sometimes wondered if it had been worth it. You'd achieved the impossible dream, risen from the very bottom of society to its heights. You had honor, recognition, legal equality with the highest nobles in the land. But you'd also traded one kind of prison for another. Instead of physical chains, you now wore invisible ones made of expectations, resentment, social isolation, and the constant need to prove you deserved what you'd earned. The chains of slavery had been simple to understand, heavy, obvious, brutal. These new chains were more subtle, but perhaps more binding. You were free in law but imprisoned by society, equal in theory but inferior in practice, successful by any measure but somehow still failing to find peace. Freedom, you discovered, was more complicated than breaking shackles. Real freedom wasn't just legal status, it was acceptance, belonging, peace of mind. And those things, no ceremony could grant, no sword could win, no amount of courage could earn. You were a knight, but you were also living proof that sometimes getting everything you thought you wanted only showed you how much you still lacked. Number 9. Legends that survived. Most knights are forgotten by history. Their names fade into dusty records. Their deeds blur together into the general background of medieval warfare and politics. Their stories disappear into the noise of countless similar lives. They lived, they fought, they died, and within a generation or two, they might as well have never existed at all. But not you. Not the knights who rose from slavery. Your stories stuck around, told and retold, embellished and mythologized, passed down through generations until they became legends that outlived the civilization that created them. Why? Because your story was too weird, too unlikely, too completely insane for people to forget. In a world where everyone was expected to live and die in the same social position they were born into, the idea of a slave becoming a knight was so extraordinary that it demanded preservation. Take the story of Saint Maurice, a legendary figure from the early medieval period. According to the tales that grew up around him, Maurice was an African slave who became a Roman soldier, then a Christian knight, then a martyr who died rather than renounce his faith. Whether he really existed or was just a useful story created by medieval propagandists, his legend spread across Europe for centuries. Churches were dedicated to Saint Maurice. Artists painted him in armor, carrying a sword, looking every bit the noble warrior. Kings claimed his protection and patronage. His story inspired countless other tales of humble origins leading to heroic deeds. The interesting thing about Saint Maurice is how his legend evolved over time. In early versions, his slave origins were emphasized, proof that God could work through anyone, regardless of birth. Later versions downplayed his slavery and emphasized his nobility of spirit, his natural worthiness for elevation. Or consider the tales that grew up around the Crusades, where desperate times and foreign battlefields created opportunities for social mobility that would have been impossible at home. Stories spread of slaves who proved themselves against Muslim armies and returned home with titles, land, and respect. Most of these stories were probably exaggerated beyond recognition, but they persisted because people wanted to believe them. They provided hope for the hopeless and legitimacy for the system that created them. The Song of Roland, one of the most famous medieval epics, includes characters who rise from humble origins to heroic status through battlefield courage. While not explicitly about slaves, these stories fed into the same fantasy that worth could triumph over birth, that virtue could overcome circumstances. But the most interesting legends weren't about the famous cases that made it into official histories. They were about the anonymous ones, the local stories passed down through generations of common people about the slave who became a knight in the next village over, or the bondsman who saved a lord's life and was rewarded with freedom and title. These stories served multiple purposes for different audiences. For slaves and peasants, they provided hope, proof that the system wasn't completely rigid, that exceptional courage or luck might offer an escape from their circumstances. Every slave who heard these tales could imagine themselves in the hero's place. For nobles, the stories were useful propaganda, suggesting that their system was fair and merit-based, even when the reality was quite different. See, they could say, good people who work hard and serve faithfully can rise in our society. The system rewards virtue. For the church, these stories demonstrated God's power to elevate the humble and reward the faithful. They became parables about divine justice working through earthly institutions. The stories also evolved and changed with each telling, becoming more heroic and less complicated over time. The jealousy of other knights was forgotten or minimized. The social isolation and practical difficulties were glossed over. The political calculations that made these elevations possible were simplified into pure moral lessons. What remained were tales of pure triumph, good people overcoming impossible odds through courage, virtue, and divine favor. The specific historical reality that a few slaves really did become knights under very particular circumstances became the foundation for much broader fantasies about social mobility and justice. Some of these legends merged with other popular story types. Tales of slave knights blended with stories of hidden princes, noble bastards, foundlings who discovered their true parentage, and other heroes of uncertain origin. The historical slave knight became a character type, the unlikely hero whose true worth was revealed through testing. These stories spread beyond their original medieval context, inspiring Renaissance literature, romantic poetry, and eventually modern movies and novels. The basic narrative, humble origins leading to greatness through courage and virtue, proved endlessly adaptable to new times and circumstances. Even today, these ancient stories resonate in ways their original tellers never could have imagined. Every movie about an underdog athlete, every novel about a commoner who saves the kingdom, every video game where you start as a nobody and become a hero, all of these draw from the same narrative tradition that began with actual slaves who became actual knights. The slave who became a knight is the ancestor of Luke Skywalker, Harry Potter, Katniss Everdeen, and countless other modern heroes who rise from nothing to change their worlds. But here's what makes the original stories so powerful and enduring. They weren't just fantasy. They really happened. Rarely, almost impossibly, under very specific historical circumstances, but they happened. In a world where social mobility was almost unknown, where the vast majority of people died in the same circumstances they were born into, the existence of even a few slaves who became knights was revolutionary. It suggested that human worth wasn't determined by birth, that courage and ability existed at every level of society, that change was possible even within the most rigid systems. The legends that grew up around these historical figures became more than entertainment. They became a form of resistance, quiet arguments against the idea that some people were naturally superior to others, subtle challenges to systems based on inherited privilege. And in the end, that might be the most important legacy of the slave knights. Not what they achieved in their own lifetimes, but the stories they inspired and the ideas those stories planted in the minds of people who came centuries later. Number 10. What it really meant. So what does it all mean? What can we learn from these impossible stories of slaves who became knights in a world specifically designed to keep them in chains forever? First, let's be completely honest about what these stories don't mean. They don't mean the medieval system was fair or just. They don't prove that anyone could make it if they just worked hard enough. They don't suggest that social mobility was common or that merit always triumphed over birth. The medieval world was built on systematic oppression, designed to keep people in their assigned places from birth to death. For every slave who became a knight, there were millions who died in bondage, their potential never recognized, their talents never developed, their dreams never realized. These exceptional stories were not proof that the system worked. They were proof that the system occasionally cracked under pressure. What they do show is something more complex and ultimately more interesting, that even the most rigid social systems have weaknesses. And sometimes, under exactly the right circumstances, a determined person can slip through those cracks and emerge somewhere completely different. The medieval world was built on the idea that God had arranged society in a perfect hierarchy. Kings ruled because God wanted them to rule. Nobles were noble because God made them that way. Peasants farmed because that was their divine calling. And slaves were slaves because that was their destiny, determined by sin, bad luck, or simple divine will. Challenge this order, the church taught, and you were challenging God himself. Try to rise above your station, and you were guilty of the sin of pride that cast Satan from heaven. This wasn't just religious theory backed up by convenient interpretations of Scripture. It was reinforced by very real, very violent social control. Slaves who tried to escape were hunted with dogs. Peasants who rebelled were slaughtered by knights. Anyone who challenged the established order faced not just human punishment but eternal damnation. But war changed everything. When kingdoms were literally fighting for survival, when battles could determine whether entire peoples lived or died, practical needs sometimes overcame ideological purity. A slave who could save your army was worth more than a dozen useless noble sons. A bondsman who could win battles was more valuable than all the pure bloodlines in Europe. When the choice was between maintaining social purity and keeping your kingdom from being conquered, pragmatism usually won. The existence of slave knights revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the medieval system. If blood and birth really determined worth, how could property become nobility? If God really arranged the social order according to divine plan, why did he sometimes allow slaves to outfight their masters? The medieval church and nobility dealt with this contradiction by making these promotions incredibly rare and surrounding them with ceremonies and conditions that reinforced the system rather than challenging it. A slave could become a knight, they argued, but only through the grace and generosity of their betters. Only after proving exceptional loyalty and service. Only by accepting that they were the exception that proved the rule. But the damage was done. Every slave knight, no matter how carefully their story was managed and controlled, demonstrated that the system was artificial. That the difference between noble and common, free and enslaved, was often just accidents of birth and circumstance. This knowledge was dangerous. It suggested that other arrangements were possible, that society could be organized differently, that worth didn't have to depend on bloodline. Most people in medieval times never acted on these implications. The system was too strong, the alternatives too unclear, the risks too great. Rebellion usually led to death, and even successful resistance rarely created lasting change. But the ideas remained, passed down through stories and legends, waiting for times when change became possible. The slave knights became symbols of human potential, proof that courage and ability existed everywhere, even in the most oppressed and discarded people. Their legacy wasn't just the individual titles they earned or the battles they won. It was the crack they opened in a system that claimed to be eternal and unchangeable. A crack that would eventually grow into revolutions, republics, and the modern idea that all people are created equal. They probably didn't think they were changing the world. They were just trying to survive, to make the best of impossible circumstances, to grab whatever small piece of dignity and respect they could manage in lives that offered precious little of either. They weren't fighting for abstract principles of equality or human rights. Those concepts didn't exist yet. They were fighting for personal freedom, for the chance to be something more than property, for the basic human desire to have some control over their own fate. But sometimes that's exactly how the world really changes. Not through grand ideological movements or carefully planned revolutions, but through individual people refusing to accept the limits their society has placed on them. One impossible story at a time. The slave nights showed that human potential existed everywhere, that artificial barriers could be overcome, that systems based on oppression contained the seeds of their own destruction. They proved that courage, intelligence, and determination could triumph over seemingly impossible obstacles. More importantly, they demonstrated that the medieval world's claims about natural hierarchy were lies. If a slave could become a knight, if property could become nobility, if the lowliest person in society could rise to its heights, then the entire system was based on convenient fiction rather than divine truth. That realization that social structures are human constructions rather than natural laws is one of the most revolutionary ideas in human history. It's the foundation of every movement for equality, every struggle for justice, every attempt to build a better world. The slave nights didn't create that idea intentionally. They were just trying to stay alive and maybe find some dignity in lives that offered precious little. But their existence, their success, their very possibility opened cracks in a system that claimed to be unbreakable. And through those cracks, eventually came the light. Number 10. What it really meant. So what does it all mean? What can we learn from these impossible stories of slaves who became knights in a world specifically designed to keep them in chains forever? First, let's be completely honest about what these stories don't mean. They don't mean the medieval system was fair or just. They don't prove that anyone could make it if they just worked hard enough. They don't suggest that social mobility was common or that merit always triumphed over birth. The medieval world was built on systematic oppression, designed to keep people in their assigned places from birth to death. For every slave who became a knight, there were millions who died in bondage, their potential never recognized, their talents never developed, their dreams never realized. These exceptional stories were not proof that the system worked. They were proof that the system occasionally cracked under pressure. What they do show is something more complex and ultimately more interesting, that even the most rigid social systems have weaknesses. And sometimes, under exactly the right circumstances, a determined person can slip through those cracks and emerge somewhere completely different. The medieval world was built on the idea that God had arranged society in a perfect hierarchy. Kings ruled because God wanted them to rule. Nobles were noble because God made them that way. Peasants farmed because that was their divine calling. And slaves were slaves because that was their destiny, determined by sin, bad luck, or simple divine will. Challenge this order, the church taught, and you were challenging God himself. Try to rise above your station, and you were guilty of the sin of pride that cast Satan from heaven. This wasn't just religious theory backed up by convenient interpretations of Scripture. It was reinforced by very real, very violent social control. Slaves who tried to escape were hunted with dogs. Peasants who rebelled were slaughtered by knights. Anyone who challenged the established order faced not just human punishment but eternal damnation. But war changed everything. When kingdoms were literally fighting for survival, when battles could determine whether entire peoples lived or died, practical needs sometimes overcame ideological purity. A slave who could save your army was worth more than a dozen useless noble sons. A bondsman who could win battles was more valuable than all the pure bloodlines in Europe. When the choice was between maintaining social purity and keeping your kingdom from being conquered, pragmatism usually won. The existence of slave knights revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the medieval system. If blood and birth really determined worth, how could property become nobility? If God really arranged the social order according to divine plan, why did he sometimes allow slaves to outfight their masters? The medieval church and nobility dealt with this contradiction by making these promotions incredibly rare and surrounding them with ceremonies and conditions that reinforced the system rather than challenging it. A slave could become a knight, they argued, but only through the grace and generosity of their betters. Only after proving exceptional loyalty and service. Only by accepting that they were the exception that proved the rule. But the damage was done. Every slave knight, no matter how carefully their story was managed and controlled, demonstrated that the system was artificial. That the difference between noble and common, free and enslaved, was often just accidents of birth and circumstance. This knowledge was dangerous. It suggested that other arrangements were possible, that society could be organized differently, that worth didn't have to depend on bloodline. Most people in medieval times never acted on these implications. The system was too strong, the alternatives too unclear, the risks too great. Rebellion usually led to death, and even successful resistance rarely created lasting change. But the ideas remained, passed down through stories and legends, waiting for times when change became possible. The slave knights became symbols of human potential, proof that courage and ability existed everywhere, even in the most oppressed and discarded people. Their legacy wasn't just the individual titles they earned or the battles they won. It was the crack they opened in a system that claimed to be eternal and unchangeable. A crack that would eventually grow into revolutions, republics, and the modern idea that all people are created equal. They probably didn't think they were changing the world. They were just trying to survive, to make the best of impossible circumstances, to grab whatever small piece of dignity and respect they could manage in lives that offered precious little of either. They weren't fighting for abstract principles of equality or human rights. Those concepts didn't exist yet. They were fighting for personal freedom, for the chance to be something more than property, for the basic human desire to have some control over their own fate. But sometimes that's exactly how the world really changes. Not through grand ideological movements or carefully planned revolutions, but through individual people refusing to accept the limits their society has placed on them. One impossible story at a time. The slave knights showed that human potential existed everywhere, that artificial barriers could be overcome, that systems based on oppression contained the seeds of their own destruction. They proved that courage, intelligence, and determination could triumph over seemingly impossible obstacles. More importantly, they demonstrated that the medieval world's claims about natural hierarchy were lies. If a slave could become a knight, if property could become nobility, if the lowliest person in society could rise to its heights, then the entire system was based on convenient fiction rather than divine truth. That realization that social structures are human constructions rather than natural laws is one of the most revolutionary ideas in human history. It's the foundation of every movement for equality, every struggle for justice, every attempt to build a better world. The slave knights didn't create that idea intentionally. They were just trying to stay alive and maybe find some dignity in lives that offered precious little. But their existence, their success, their very possibility opened cracks in a system that claimed to be unbreakable. And through those cracks, eventually came the light.